I remember the exact moment Chief Apothecary Theron's hand began to tremble. Not from age, though he had served the Crimson Wardens for 4 centuries. Not from fear, though what his gene scanner revealed should have frozen the blood in any warrior's veins. His hand trembled because the 3 progenoid glands laid out on the examination table before him, each extracted from a fallen brother during the Kaltos Vix campaign, showed identical patterns of genetic degradation that should have been impossible. The sterile white light of the apothecarian cast harsh shadows across the sacred tissue samples, making the discoloration more pronounced. Where healthy gene seed possessed the rich crimson hue that gave our chapter its name, these organs had taken on a sickly violet undertone, like a bruise spreading beneath the skin of something dying slowly from within. The apothecarian occupied the deepest sanctum of our fortress monastery, a place where the temperature never varied from 18 degrees Celsius and the air tasted of recycled oxygen filtered through blessed carbon scrubbers. Every surface gleamed with the sterile precision that our founding chapter master had demanded when the Crimson Wardens were first created in the 36th millennium. 8,000 years of genetic continuity, now possibly ending on a cold examination table beneath flickering lumens. The walls were lined with cryopreservation units containing the gene seed of every brother who had fallen in service. Thousands upon thousands of small crystalline chambers, each one a potential future warrior, each one now suspect. The low hum of the preservation systems created a constant drone that had always seemed soothing before, but now felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to extinction. Theron was older than most of the chapter, his face bearing the weight of centuries spent maintaining our most sacred duty: gene seed preservation, gene seed purity, gene seed continuity. The apothecaries of every chapter carried this burden, but Theron had taken it upon himself with a zealotry that bordered on obsession. I had served as his assistant for only 30 years. Still young by Astartes standards at merely 112 years of service, and I had watched him perform thousands of gene seed extractions and implantations with the precision of a master craftsman. His hands never trembled, his focus never wavered, until today. "Brother Cale," he said, his voice carrying that peculiar flatness that Space Marines develop when suppressing extreme emotion. "Summon the chapter master. Do not use the Vox. Tell no one else what you have seen here." I felt the weight of those words settle into my bones like lead. In a chapter of 1,000 brothers, secrets were rare. In the apothecarian, secrets were heresy. Gene seed purity was a matter of absolute transparency, regularly reported to Terra as part of the ancient compact between the Adeptus Astartes and the Adeptus Terra. Every progenoid gland extracted, every implantation performed, every battle brother created was meticulously documented and transmitted to Mars for the records of the Mechanicus. The fact that Theron wanted to keep this discovery even momentarily hidden told me that what lay on that examination table represented something far worse than a simple mutation or implantation failure. I found Chapter Master Velerin in the meditation chamber overlooking the Scorian wastes, the toxic desert that surrounded our fortress monastery like a moat of poison. He stood before the great armor glass viewport, his ceramite warplate still bearing the scorch marks from the Kaltos Vix campaign, where we had lost 19 brothers to the Greenskin Horde. 19 brothers. 19 progenoid glands that should have been extracted, preserved, and used to create 38 new warriors. Instead, those glands now represented something else entirely. Evidence of our doom. Valoran turned as I approached, his face stern beneath the service studs that marked 400 years of continuous warfare. "Brother Cale, your presence in this chamber, at this hour, outside of scheduled devotionals, suggests an emergency. Chief Apothecary Theron requests your immediate presence in the Apothecarian, my lord." He emphasized discretion. Something flickered in Valoran's eyes. He had commanded the Crimson Wardens for 80 years, and a warrior did not reach such rank without developing an instinct for catastrophe. He followed me without another word, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors of the fortress monastery with the heavy rhythm of ceramite on stone. We passed through the Hall of Remembrance, where the names of every fallen brother since our founding were inscribed in letters of gold, 10,000 names spanning 80 centuries, each one a link in the chain of genetic continuity that might now be breaking. The smell of incense from the morning devotionals still lingered in the air, mixed with the ever-present scent of machine oil and the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere. When we entered the Apothecarian, Theron stood exactly as I had left him, staring down at the 3 progenoid glands as if they were Xeno's artifacts or pieces of forbidden archaeotech. The gene scanner's display screen cast a pale blue glow across his face, highlighting the deep lines that marked his centuries of service. Valoran approached the examination table, and I watched his expression shift from curiosity to concern to something approaching horror as he studied the tissue samples. "Explain," Valoran said simply. Theron activated the gene scanner's hololithic display, and suddenly the air above the examination table filled with swirling patterns of genetic code, rendered in luminous green characters. To an untrained eye, it would have looked like meaningless data, but I had studied under Theron long enough to recognize the telltale markers of progenoid gene seed, and to recognize that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing. These 3 progenoid glands were harvested from brothers Cathon, Veros, and Julio, following the Kaltos 6 engagement. Theron began, his voice taking on the clinical detachment of a Medicae reporting on a corpse. Standard extraction protocols were followed. No signs of chaos corruption, no warp taint, no Xenos contamination. The brothers died clean deaths in honorable combat. However, upon examination, all 3 glands show identical patterns of genetic degradation. He manipulated the hololithic display, highlighting specific genetic sequences that pulsed red against the green background. Here, here, and here. The os-modular gene sequence shows a point mutation at locus 477. The Biscopia markers have shifted by 3 base pairs. The hemastamen shows early signs of protein misfolding that would lead to implantation rejection within 2 decades. Valoran leaned closer, his enhanced vision no doubt picking out details that I could barely perceive. 3 brothers, same mutations. That suggests environmental exposure or contamination during implantation. That was my first hypothesis, Theron said, and the way he emphasized first sent a chill down my fused spine. However, I ran retrospective analyses on gene seed samples extracted over the past 50 years. He pulled up another hololithic display, this one showing a cascading waterfall of genetic data spanning decades. The degradation has been occurring gradually, across the entire chapter, for at least 73 years. The mutations are accumulating with each generation of implantation. The silence that followed was absolute. In the background, the cryopreservation units continued their eternal hum, but it seemed distant now, as if the entire Apothecarian had been sealed inside a bubble of horror from which no sound could escape. I found myself counting my own heartbeats, the steady rhythm created by my 3-chambered Astartes heart, wondering how many more beats that organ had left before the genetic instructions that created it degraded beyond function. "How is this possible?" Valoran asked, and for the first time in 30 years of service under his command, I heard uncertainty in his voice. "Our gene seed is directly descended from the Ultramarines' lineage. Robout Gilliman's gene seed is among the most stable in the Imperium. We have maintained strict purity protocols since our founding. Every brother is screened. Every implantation is monitored. Every extraction is blessed and preserved according to the ancient rites." Theron deactivated the hololithic displays and looked directly at the chapter master. "It is not chaos corruption. It is not Xeno's influence. It is not environmental contamination. It is genetic drift, my lord. Natural, inevitable, and terminal." He paused, and when he continued, each word fell like a hammer blow. "Our gene seed is dying. Not because of any enemy action, not because of any failure of purity or protocol. But because we are 8,000 years old, and genetic material cannot maintain perfect fidelity forever, each time we extract a progenoid and implant it into a new aspirant, tiny errors accumulate. Errors that our apothecaries cannot detect, that our screening protocols cannot prevent, that our devotionals and blessings cannot halt. We are not being destroyed. We are wearing out. Valoran turned away from the examination table and walked to the far wall of the apothecarian, where the chapter's gene seed tithe to Terra was kept in a specially blessed reliquary. Every 10 years, we sent a portion of our extracted gene seed to Mars as part of our sacred duty to the Imperium, a tradition dating back to the second founding itself. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "At current degradation rates, our gene seed will be completely unusable within 200 years. Perhaps 220 if we implement extreme preservation protocols and cease all combat operations to minimize extraction cycles. But the mutations are accelerating. Each new generation shows more damage than the last. We are past the point of reversal, my lord. We are dying." I wanted to speak, to protest, to offer some solution or alternative that these two warriors with their centuries of experience had somehow overlooked. But I was young, barely more than a century old, and I understood that this was not a problem that could be solved with bolter fire or chainsword strikes. This was the slow, inevitable decay of genetic entropy, as unstoppable as the heat death of the universe, and far more personal. "What do we do?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. Valoran turned back to face us, and I saw the moment when certainty returned to his features. A chapter master did not achieve his rank through indecision. We petition Terra for fresh gene seed. The Adeptus Terra maintains repositories of pure stock from every loyal Primarch. We will request a full genetic refresh, replacing our entire stock with pristine samples descended directly from Gilliman. It has been done before, for chapters suffering warp taint or Xenos corruption. Theron nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The process will require approval from the High Lords of Terra, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the Inquisition. The investigation alone could take decades. The actual genetic replacement, assuming approval, would take a century or more to implement across the entire chapter. "Then we begin immediately," Valoran said. "Theron, prepare a comprehensive report documenting the degradation, including all retrospective analyses and projections. Spare no detail. Make it clear that this is not chaos corruption or genetic impurity, but natural decay requiring intervention. Kale, you will assist him. No one else is to know the full extent of this crisis until we receive word from Terra. Is that understood?" We both nodded, and Valoran departed, his footsteps echoing the way down the corridor toward the astropathic choir chamber, where our psychic communication specialists would encode and transmit his petition across the vast distances of the Imperium. I turned back to the examination table, staring at the 3 progenoid glands that had revealed our doom, and wondered if somewhere in the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, other chapters were discovering the same terrible truth. That nothing lasted forever. Not even the warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. The next 6 months became a blur of genetic analysis and documentation. Theron and I worked in shifts that stretched across days, sleeping only when our enhanced physiology absolutely demanded it, subsisting on nutrient paste and recycled water while we compiled the most comprehensive genetic audit in our chapter's history. We examined every progenoid gland in our repositories, dating back 8,000 years. We cross-referenced extraction records with combat deployments, looking for any pattern that might suggest external contamination rather than internal decay. We ran simulation after simulation, modeling the progression of degradation into the future, watching our chapter's genetic viability collapse in hololithic displays that showed nothing but red warnings and cascade failures. The truth was undeniable. We were dying. And we had perhaps been dying since our very founding. The degradation so gradual that no single generation of apothecaries could have detected it, only becoming visible when viewed across the vast sweep of millennia. It was the genomic equivalent of watching a star die, too slow to perceive in a single lifetime, but inevitable and absolute when measured against the appropriate timescale. If you have ever wondered what it means to serve something larger than yourself, only to discover that the very foundation of your existence is crumbling, let your engagement be a witness to what comes next. Leave the word "witnessed" in the comments. 318 days after that first discovery, Chapter Master Valoran stood before the assembled chapter in the Hall of Convocations and told 792 brothers that our gene seed was dying. I watched from my position among the apothecarian staff as shock rippled through the gathered warriors like a shockwave from an orbital bombardment. These were men who had faced orcs and traitors and Xenos horrors without flinching, who had stood in the breach when worlds burned and civilizations fell, and I saw something I had never seen before in the eyes of my brothers. Fear, not of death, for every space marine accepts death as the natural conclusion of service, but fear of meaninglessness. Fear that their sacrifices would lead nowhere. Fear that the chain of genetic continuity stretching back to the Emperor himself might end with them. Valoran did not sugarcoat the truth or offer false hope. He presented Theron's findings with brutal clarity, showing the same holiothic displays that had revealed our doom to me months earlier. He explained genetic drift and accumulated mutations in terms that even the newest initiates could understand. And then he told them that we had petitioned Terra for fresh gene seed and that we would continue to serve with honor until either salvation arrived or extinction claimed us. "We are the Crimson Wardens," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "For 8,000 years we have stood watch over the Scorian sector. We have bled for the Imperium on 1,000 worlds. We have never retreated, never surrendered, never faltered in our duty. If this is to be our last century or our last millennia, then we will face it as we have faced every enemy, with bolter and blade, with honor and fury, with absolute dedication to the Emperor and the Imperium we serve. We are dying, brothers, so we will die well." The roar that erupted from 792 throats shook the very walls of the fortress monastery. It was defiance and acceptance combined, the battle cry of warriors who had just learned they were already dead, but refused to act like corpses. In that moment, I felt a surge of pride in my chapter that transcended the horror of our situation. We would not go gentle into extinction. We would rage against it until the very last brother fell. But after the gathering dispersed and the fortress monastery returned to its normal rhythms of training and devotionals and maintenance, I found myself alone in the apothecarian, staring at the cryopreservation units and doing the mathematics of extinction. We could create no new warriors without gene seed, and our gene seed grew more unreliable with each passing year. The degradation rate that Theron had calculated meant that within 50 years, our implantation success rate would drop below 50%. Within a century, it would be near zero. We had perhaps one more generation of space marines that we could create before the genetic material became too unstable to use. One generation, maybe 200 brothers, if we were aggressive in recruitment and accepted higher failure rates. And then no more. The 792 warriors currently serving would gradually fall in combat, one by one, and there would be no replacements. Our numbers would dwindle. Eventually, we would lack the manpower to maintain our fortress monastery, to crew our battle barges, to garrison our worlds. Eventually, we would cease to be a functional chapter and become a collection of aging warriors clinging to the memory of what we once were. And eventually, the last Crimson Warden would die, and 8,000 years of history would end with a wheeze and a rattle and a body cooling in ceramite armor, unless Terra responded. Unless the Adeptus Terra, in their infinite bureaucracy and unfathomable wisdom, recognized the urgency of our situation and granted us access to fresh gene seed. Unless the High Lords of Terra chose to save us rather than let natural selection take its course. Unless 1,000 administrative officials across 1,000,000 worlds processed our petition with speed rather than the usual glacial pace of imperial bureaucracy. I tried to calculate the probability of timely response, but the variables were too numerous and too uncertain. How long to reach Terra through the vagaries of warp travel? How long for the astropathic message to be received, decoded, and delivered to the appropriate officials? How long for those officials to review our petition and pass it up the chain of authority? How long for the High Lords to convene and deliberate and decide? How long for the Mechanicus to prepare gene seed samples and transport them across half the galaxy to our corner of the Imperium? Months, certainly. Years, probably. Decades, possibly. And we had 2 centuries before complete genetic failure. The first response from Terra arrived 1 year, 7 months, and 13 days after we transmitted our petition. I was in the Apothecarian when the servitor delivered the sealed data slate bearing the seal of the Adeptus Administratum. Theron opened it with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will, and I watched his face as he read the contents. When he finished, he set the data slate down on the examination table next to a fresh progenoid gland we had just extracted from Brother Thamos, who had fallen during a boarding action against Dark Eldar raiders. "Acknowledgement of receipt," Theron said flatly. "Our petition has been logged, classified, and entered into the priority queue for review by the appropriate subdepartment of the Departamento Biologis. Estimated review time is 18 to 36 months, after which it will be forwarded to the High Lord's administrative staff for preliminary assessment. 18 to 36 months, just for the first review. Not approval. Not action. Just acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, might eventually look at our request and decide whether it warranted further attention. I felt something cold settle into my chest, replacing the hope I had been carefully nurturing for the past year. This was the Imperium I served, vast beyond comprehension, powerful beyond measure, and utterly indifferent to the struggles of individual chapters, unless those struggles affected the greater strategic situation. We were dying, but we were dying slowly. And in an Imperium where entire worlds burned and billions died screaming every day, our gradual extinction over 2 centuries probably seemed like a low-priority problem. "What do we tell the chapter master?" I asked. "The truth," Theron replied. "That we have been heard, and that the wheels of bureaucracy are turning. Whether they will turn fast enough to save us remains to be seen." The years began to blur together after that initial response. We continued our duties with mechanical precision, recruiting and implanting new aspirants, despite the increasing failure rates. Deploying to combat zones when called upon by the sector command, maintaining our fortress monastery and equipment and traditions as if we had millennia ahead of us rather than decades. The degradation continued according to Theron's projections, as reliable as a chronometer and as unstoppable as entropy. Every new batch of aspirants showed higher rejection rates. Every extracted progenoid gland showed more pronounced mutations. And Terra remained silent except for periodic acknowledgments that our petition was under review or waiting assessment or pending authorization. Each message arrived months or years apart. Each one offering nothing but confirmation that we had not been forgotten, merely placed in a queue of indeterminate length behind countless other petitions and requests and demands from across the galaxy. In year 3, our implantation success rate dropped to 73%. 12 aspirants died during the enhancement process when their bodies rejected the degraded gene seed. We held funeral rites for all 12, honoring them as battle brothers who had given their lives in service even though they had never worn power armor or fired a bolter in combat. In year 5, we received confirmation that our petition had been reviewed by the Departamento Biologis and forwarded to the High Lord's administrative staff with a recommendation for cautious consideration and further investigation. No timeline was provided for when that investigation might begin. In year 8, Chapter Master Valoran fell in combat against a Tyranid splinter fleet that boiled out of the eastern fringe and engulfed 3 systems before we managed to halt its advance. He died as he had lived, standing between the Imperium and annihilation. His last words a command to hold the line. We extracted his progenoid glands and added them to our dwindling stock, knowing that they carried the same genetic degradation that had doomed him to be among the last generation of Crimson Wardens. Chapter Master Arcturus took command. Younger and more aggressive than Valoran, determined to make every remaining year count. In year 12, our implantation success rate dropped below 50%. We began selecting only the very best aspirants, young men who showed exceptional physical resilience and genetic compatibility. But even they died at rates that would have been considered catastrophic in earlier centuries. The Apothecarian became a place of constant mourning, the smell of failure hanging in the recycled air alongside the scents of antiseptic and machine oil. In year 17, we received notification that the High Lords of Terra had authorized a preliminary investigation into our gene seed situation, and that a delegation from the Adeptus Mechanicus would be dispatched to conduct in-depth genetic analysis at their earliest convenience. No arrival date was provided. In year 2001, the Mechanicus delegation arrived. 3 tech priests and a small army of servitors, all swathed in red robes and trailing cables and mechadendrites like the tentacles of some deep ocean creature. They took over the Apothecarian for 4 months, running tests and analyses that duplicated everything Theron and I had already documented, confirming what we had known for 2 decades. Our gene seed was degrading through natural genetic drift. It was not chaos corruption. It was not Xeno's influence. It was simply age and entropy taking their inevitable toll. Fascinating, the lead tech priest said, his voice emerging from box speakers embedded in his throat. Your chapter represents a unique opportunity to study long-term genetic stability in Astartes enhancement procedures. We would like to establish a permanent monitoring station to track the degradation's progression. I wanted to scream at him that we were not a research opportunity, that we were warriors dying by degrees, while the Imperium we served documented our extinction with scientific detachment. But I remained silent, because he was correct in his assessment, even if his priorities were inhuman. We were a data point in a galaxy-spanning study of genetic engineering, and our individual suffering was irrelevant compared to the knowledge that might save other chapters in the future. The tech priests departed in year 22 with terabytes of genetic data and a promise to submit their findings to the High Lords with appropriate recommendations for intervention. We never saw them again. In year 2009, Chief Apothecary Theron died. Not in combat, which would have been fitting for a warrior of his stature, but in the Apothecarian, slumped over the same examination table where he had first discovered our doom 3 decades earlier. His heart simply stopped, worn out by centuries of service and the accumulated stress of watching everything he had dedicated his life to preserve slowly disintegrate. I found him during my morning rounds, his face peaceful in death, one hand still resting on a gene scanner, as if he had been working until the very end. We extracted his progenoid glands, knowing they were too degraded to use, but preserving them anyway out of respect for what he had been. I became Chief Apothecary at age 142, younger than most who had held the position, but there were few choices left as our senior brothers gradually fell. In year 36, we received word from Terra. Final word. Official word. The kind of communication that arrives on ferrocrete-thick parchment, bearing 17 different seals, and authenticated with genetic markers that prove it originated from the High Lords themselves. Chapter Master Arcturus summoned me to read it alongside him. Perhaps because I had been there at the beginning of this slow catastrophe, or perhaps because he needed a witness to what he somehow already knew the message would contain. Request for genetic material refresh. Chapter designation, Crimson Wardens, status. Denied reasoning, current gene seed reserves insufficient to support systematic distribution to chapters experiencing non-crisis. Degradation, priority allocation reserved for chapters suffering critical combat losses or chaos contamination. Recommendation, Chapter Crimson Wardens to continue current operations with existing genetic material. Situation to be racist in 50 to 100 years pending gen seed production increases. I read it 3 times, certain I must have misunderstood something. That there must be some clause or provision that I had missed that would offer us hope or alternatives or anything other than the cold bureaucratic death sentence that these words represented. But there was nothing else. Just a polite acknowledgement that we were dying, and an equally polite suggestion that we continue dying while Terra reassessed our situation sometime in the next century, 50 to 100 years. We had 163 years remaining before our gene seed became completely unusable. "They're telling us to go extinct," I said, the words emerging before I could stop them. "They're telling us we're not important enough to save," Arcturus corrected, his voice carrying that same flatness I had heard from Theron so many years ago. 8,000 years of loyal service, and we have been weighed against the Imperium's strategic priorities and found wanting. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the Scorian wastes, just as Valoran had done on the day I informed him of our crisis. Perhaps all chapter masters eventually found themselves drawn to that view, staring out at the poisonous wasteland and seeing a reflection of their own mortality. "We will not inform the chapter of this decision," he said after a long silence. "Let them believe that hope still exists. Let them think that Terra will save us eventually. It will make no practical difference to our operations, and it may spare them the knowledge that they serve an Imperium that has already written them off as acceptable losses." "That's a lie, my lord," I said, and then immediately regretted my bluntness. But Arcturus only nodded. "Yes, but it is a kind lie, and kindness has become a rare commodity in our situation. Do you believe they would fight any less fiercely if they knew the truth? Do you think it would change anything?" I thought about that question for a long time. Would it change anything? We were already doing everything possible to preserve our gene seed, already recruiting as aggressively as our degrading success rates allowed, already serving with absolute dedication to the Imperium despite our impending extinction. Knowing that Terra had abandoned us would add despair to our burden but would subtract nothing from our duty. In the calculus of military efficiency, Arcturus was correct. The lie was kinder than the truth. "No, my lord," I finally said. "It would change nothing. Then we keep this between us," he said, "and we continue to serve, because that is what we are. That is what we have always been. That is what we will remain until the last Crimson Warden falls. Do you understand, Brother Kale?" "I understand, my lord. We are already dead. We simply haven't finished dying yet." If this revelation of bureaucratic indifference makes you question what service truly means in the Imperium, show your witness. Subscribe so these stories endure when memory fails. The decades that followed that final rejection from Terra took on a strange quality of resigned determination. We continued to function as a chapter, recruiting and training new initiates, deploying to combat zones when called upon, maintaining our fortress monastery and equipment with the same attention to detail that had characterized our service for 8 millennia. But underlying every action was the knowledge that we were performing maintenance on a structure that was already collapsing, that each new brother we created brought us one step closer to having no gene seed left to create another. Our implantation success rates continued their steady decline, dropping below 40% in year 43, below 30% in year 59, below 20% in year 72. We filled the Apothecarian with the bodies of aspirants who had died during the enhancement process, young men whose genetic makeup simply could not accommodate the increasingly unstable gene seed we implanted into them. Each death felt like a double loss, the waste of a potential warrior, and the consumption of genetic material that brought us closer to exhaustion. In year 68, we attempted a radical solution proposed by the new generation of apothecaries who had trained under my supervision. If our gene seed was degrading through accumulated genetic errors, perhaps we could use ancient techniques of genetic manipulation to manually correct those errors, essentially editing our genetic material back toward its original configuration. It was dangerous, potentially heretical if the Inquisition decided that genetic manipulation bordered on forbidden science, but we were desperate enough to try. We established a sealed research facility in the deepest levels of the fortress monastery, far below even the apothecarian, in chambers that had once been used for storing archaeotech recovered from the dark age of technology. 3 of our apothecaries worked in shifts for 2 years, using gene manipulation tools that we had acquired through questionable channels from rogue tech priests, attempting to reverse engineer the degradation process and repair the damage that centuries had inflicted on our gene seed. The project failed catastrophically in year 70. An error in the genetic sequencing caused a cascade failure in one of our stored progenoid glands, triggering a sympathetic reaction in 17 other samples stored in the same cryo unit before we could isolate the contamination. We lost 18 units of gene seed in a single day, enough to have created 36 warriors, destroyed not through honorable service, but through our own desperate attempt to cheat entropy. The 3 apothecaries who had been working on the project requested permission to take their own lives in penance for the loss, but Chapter Master Arcturus refused. We needed every brother we had, even those who had made catastrophic mistakes, because we could no longer afford the luxury of suicide as atonement. We sealed the research facility and never spoke of the experiment again, except in the most secret councils where chapter masters and chief apothecaries discussed matters too dangerous for general knowledge. I added a notation to the apothecarian records documenting the failure so that future generations would not attempt the same solution and suffer the same losses. Though increasingly I wondered if there would be future generations to read those warnings. In year 83, we fought our last major campaign as a full-strength chapter. The Kratos Rebellion had engulfed 7 systems in the Scorian sector, a confluence of heretical elements and opportunistic Xenos raiders taking advantage of Imperial overextension in the wake of some greater crisis in the Galactic East. We deployed with 542 battle brothers, 3 companies of warriors supported by our remaining dreadnoughts and vehicles, and crushed the rebellion through a series of brutal boarding actions and planetary assaults that became textbook examples of space marine warfare. We lost 106 brothers in that campaign. 106 sets of progenoid glands extracted and preserved, each one carrying genetic material that was now nearly 70 years more degraded than when we had first discovered our crisis. I performed the extractions myself in most cases, working in field conditions aboard our battle barge, the smell of blood and burnt flesh mixing with the chemical scents of preservation fluids. Each extraction took on a ritualistic quality, my hands moving through the familiar motions of cutting and extracting and preserving, while my mind screamed at the futility of it all. I was preserving genetic material that would probably never be used, saving gene seed that was already too corrupt to reliably implant, performing a sacred duty that had become a performance of empty motions. But I continued, because that was what apothecaries did. We preserved gene seed. We maintained the chain of genetic continuity. We performed our duty even when that duty had lost its meaning. Because the alternative was to acknowledge that meaning itself was dead, and we were simply acting out the remaining scenes of a tragedy whose ending had already been written. In year 95, Terra sent another communication. This one was brief. A simple acknowledgement that our situation had been noted for future reassessment, and that we should continue current operations pending strategic priority adjustments. It arrived exactly 100 years after our initial petition, and I wondered if some clerk on Terra had simply set a reminder to send periodic responses, a bureaucratic heartbeat that confirmed we had not been completely forgotten, even if we had been completely abandoned. Chapter Master Arcturus died in year 103, not in combat, but in his meditation chamber, sitting in the same spot where Chapter Master Valoran had stood when I first summoned him to learn of our doom. He had served as Chapter Master for 95 years, longer than most, and his death felt like the breaking of another link in the chain connecting us to our past. We extracted his progenoid glands and held funeral rites that lasted 3 days, honoring a warrior who had led us through our darkest period with unwavering determination and a burden of knowledge that he shared with only a handful of brothers. Chapter Master Sorvak took command, and I realized with a shock that he was younger than me, only 120 years old compared to my 193. The chapter was aging out, our senior leadership dying faster than we could replace it, the demographics of our force skewing older and more veteran with each passing year. We were becoming the chapter of ancients, warriors in their 3rd and 4th centuries of service, because we could not create enough new brothers to maintain a proper age distribution. In year 119, our implantation success rate dropped below 10%. Out of every 100 aspirants we selected and began the enhancement process upon, 91 died. Some during the initial implantation of the gene seed organs, others during the subsequent phases of chemical and hormonal treatment. A few made it all the way through to receiving their final implants before their bodies catastrophically rejected the genetic material and shut down in cascades of organ failure and neurological collapse. We held funeral rites so frequently that they became a routine part of apothecarian operations, the smell of burning offerings and funeral incense permanently saturating the recycled air. The apothecarian itself had become a place of ghosts, echoing with the memories of brothers who had served and died and been replaced, and died again across centuries of continuous operation. I sometimes stood alone in the chamber late at night, after the day's duties were complete, and the only sounds were the hum of cryopreservation units and the distant rumble of the fortress monastery's life support systems, and imagined I could hear the voices of everyone who had come before. Theron giving instructions on proper gene seed extraction, Valoran delivering the terrible news to an assembled chapter. The aspirants who had died screaming as their enhanced organs rejected and consumed them from within. The whisper of genetic continuity breaking down base pair by base pair, century by century, until nothing remained but noise and corruption. In year 137, we fell below 400 battle brothers for the first time since the dark days following the Kokondian Crusade 6,000 years ago. We could no longer field a full battle company according to Codex Astartes' organization, could no longer deploy to multiple theaters simultaneously, could no longer maintain our traditional garrison responsibilities across the Scorian sector. We contracted our area of operations, consolidating our forces around our fortress monastery and the 3 most strategically vital systems. Abandoning worlds we had defended for millennia to local planetary defense forces and praying that they would be sufficient to hold against whatever threats emerged. The abandonment felt like another kind of death, the shrinking of our presence in the galaxy mirroring the shrinking of our gene seed reserves and our battle strength. We were becoming less, diminishing in every measurable way, and there was nothing we could do to halt or slow the process. We simply continued to exist, day by day, year by year, growing smaller and older and fewer, until extinction became not a distant future threat, but a present reality that we inhabited like a shroud. In year 153, I realized that I was the oldest living member of the chapter at 205 years of service. Every brother senior to me had fallen in combat or died of accumulated damage from centuries of warfare. I had become the chapter's living memory, the last direct link to the day when Theron first discovered our genetic doom. Everyone else who had been present for that terrible moment was dead, their progenoid glands extracted and preserved and degraded beyond usefulness. I alone remained to remember how it began, and I carried that knowledge like a weight in my fused ribcage, pressing down on my 3 hearts with increasing force. Chapter Master Sorvak summoned me to his chambers in year 162, and I knew what he was going to say before he spoke the words. We had reached the point that Theron had predicted 162 years ago. Our gene seed had degraded to the point of complete unreliability. The last batch of implantations had resulted in a 100% failure rate, 12 aspirants dead before any of them could receive their final organ implants. We could no longer create new space marines. The Crimson Wardens would have no next generation. We were, all of us, the last of our kind. How many brothers remain? Sorvak asked, though he certainly already knew the answer. 247, my lord, I said, plus 19 interred in Dreadnought chassis, though 3 of those have been inactive for decades due to parts shortages. And our gene seed reserves? 843 individual progenoid glands in cryostorage, all of them too degraded for reliable implantation based on current genetic analysis. We could attempt emergency implantations if absolutely necessary, but I would estimate a survival rate of less than 1%. Sorvak nodded slowly, his face bearing the weight of knowledge that had broken stronger men. So this is how it ends. Not in a last stand against overwhelming odds, not in a final charge that changes the course of history, but in silence and gradual decay, our numbers dwindling until we simply cease to exist. Yes, my lord. How long? I had run these calculations so many times that the numbers had burned themselves into my memory. At current attrition rates, accounting for combat losses, training accidents, and natural degradation of enhanced physiology, the chapter will fall below 100 battle brothers within 18 years. Below 50 within 31 years. The last Crimson Warden will likely die approximately 55 years from now, barring any unexpected catastrophes or unusually successful campaigns. 55 years. A single human lifetime. Less than a tenth of my own age. Nothing in the scales of Space Marine service or Imperial history. We had 8,000 years of continuity behind us, and 55 years ahead of us, and then we would be nothing but a footnote in the records of the Adeptus Astartes. A chapter that died not through any particular heroism or tragedy, but simply because genetic material could not maintain perfect fidelity forever, and the Imperium's bureaucracy moved too slowly to save us. Have we received any further communication from Terra? Sorvak asked. Nothing in 17 years, my lord. The last message suggested reassessment in 50 to 100 years. If they maintain that timeline, we will likely be extinct before they respond. So we are forgotten. Yes, my lord, we are forgotten. Sorvak stood and walked to the window overlooking the Scorian wastes, continuing a tradition that every chapter master since Valeran had maintained. I wondered if they all saw the same things in that toxic desert, whether the poisonous landscape offered some insight into command that I, as merely an apothecary, could not perceive, or whether they simply needed to look at something vast and inhospitable to remind themselves of the larger context of their service. I want you to prepare a final record, Sorvak said after a long silence. Document everything. Our founding, our campaigns, our gene seed crisis, Terra's response, and lack thereof. I want every detail preserved, so that if anyone ever bothers to investigate why the Crimson Wardens disappeared from Imperial records, they will know that we served with honor until the very end. Can you do that, Brother Kale? Yes, my lord. Good. And Kale, make sure they know it was bureaucracy that killed us, not chaos. Not Xenos, not heresy or failure or any kind of corruption, but paperwork, delays, strategic priorities, the machinery of the Imperium grinding too slowly to save one chapter among thousands. I want that truth preserved, even if it damns us as bitter old warriors who died complaining about forms and procedures. They won't care, my lord. No one will care. I know. But truth matters even when no one cares, especially then. Now get out of my sight before I order you to stop calling me my lord, like we're still a proper chapter instead of a graveyard waiting to be sealed. I left him there, silhouetted against the window, and I wondered if he would follow the tradition of previous chapter masters and die in that room, staring out at the wastes. But he surprised me by living another 6 years. Falling in a minor skirmish against Orc raiders that should have been routine, but turned deadly through bad luck, and the kind of cascading failures that occur when a force lacks sufficient numbers to maintain proper tactical flexibility. The chapter's masters who came after him lasted progressively shorter periods. Master Krevan, 11 years. Master Tordicus, 7 years. Master Vane, 4 years. We were burning through our remaining leadership as our numbers dwindled, promoting younger and less experienced brothers to positions of authority because there was no one else left. By year 190, we had fallen below 200 battle brothers, and our area of operations had contracted to just our fortress monastery and the immediate system. We could no longer deploy off-world in any meaningful strength. We had become garrison troops in our own home, waiting for the inevitable. In year 195, Terra responded one final time. The message arrived via astropathic transmission, garbled by the vast distances and the unreliability of warp communication, but clear enough in its essential content. The High Lords of Terra had completed their reassessment of our gene seed request and determined that the strategic situation had improved sufficiently to allocate fresh genetic material to chapters experiencing non-critical degradation. However, further review of our specific case revealed that the amount of gene seed required for complete genetic refresh was beyond current production capacity. Therefore, our request remained denied. But we were welcome to submit a new petition for reconsideration in another century. Another century, when we would be nothing but dust and fading records. Chapter Master Vane summoned me to read the message, and we stood together in his chambers, staring at the data slate as if it were a Xenos artifact that might explode if we looked away. I was 247 years old, ancient by any standard, my enhanced physiology beginning to show the signs of accumulated damage that presaged eventual system failure. Vane was barely 100, a child by comparison, elevated to chapter master because everyone older than him had already died. Together, we represented the alpha and omega of the Crimson Warden's remaining existence. Should we even bother telling anyone? Vane asked. No, my lord. It would serve no purpose except to confirm what we already knew. Terra won't save us. Terra can't save us. And frankly, Terra doesn't particularly care whether we live or die. You've become bitter in your old age, Kale. I've become honest in my old age. There's a difference, though it's subtle. He laughed at that, a sound I hadn't heard from a chapter master in decades. Honesty, yes. That's what we've earned through 2 centuries of dying slowly. The right to be honest about how little we matter. He set the data slate down and looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than his actual century of service. How much longer? 22 years, my lord. Perhaps 30, if we're very lucky, and avoid major combat. That's not a projection. That's a countdown. Then we have time for one more campaign. One last deployment worthy of remembrance. I won't have us die in our fortress, like cowards afraid to face the galaxy. We barely have enough battle brothers to crew a single strike cruiser, my lord. Any major engagement will likely result in catastrophic casualties. Yes, Vane said simply. That's exactly the point. I understood then what he was proposing, and some part of me that still remembered being young and idealistic and hopeful, recoiled at the implications. But the larger part, the part that had watched us die slowly for 2 centuries, recognized the mercy in what he was suggesting. Better to burn out in a single glorious conflagration than to fade gradually into nothing, our last brothers dying in training accidents or equipment failures or simply old age. Better to choose our ending than to have it chosen for us by entropy and time. It's a kind of suicide, my lord. It's a kind of service, and you taught me that service is what we are, what we've always been, what will remain until the last Crimson Warden falls. Do you still believe that, KL? Or have 2 centuries of bitter truth burned that faith out of you? I thought about that question for a long time, examining my own hearts and finding them still beating with purpose even after everything we had endured. I still believe it, my lord, even knowing that our service matters to no one, even knowing that we'll be forgotten, even knowing that we died from paperwork rather than from anything meaningful. I still believe that service is its own justification. Then let's serve one last time, properly. As Crimson Wardens, as Adeptus Astartes, as warriors of the Emperor who were too stubborn to die quietly, even when they should have. He stood and reached for the ceremonial blade that every chapter master carried, passing it to me. "You're the oldest living Crimson Warden. You're the memory of what we were and the witness to what we've become. So you get to choose where we make our last stand. Where should we die, Brother Cale? If the weight of this decision, of choosing where warriors go to die knowing they won't return, resonates with you, let it be remembered. Comment, eternal, for those who serve beyond hope. I chose the Hetheron system, a cluster of mining worlds in the outer reaches of the Scorian sector that had been sending increasingly desperate calls for aid against a growing orc infestation. It wasn't strategic, wasn't particularly important in the grand scheme of Imperial operations, and probably wouldn't have received any response from larger military forces for years, if at all. But it was Imperial territory inhabited by Imperial citizens, and it was within our capabilities to defend even with our diminished numbers. And most importantly, it would give us a chance to die the way we had lived, standing between the Imperium and its enemies, serving long past the point when service had any meaning. We deployed with 137 battle brothers, everything we could muster that was combat capable. The rest remained behind to maintain the fortress monastery, though we all knew that distinction was merely symbolic. Without new brothers to replace losses, without gene seed to create future generations, the fortress would eventually become a tomb regardless of how many warriors we left to garrison it. Better that we all went together, but tradition demanded that some remain behind, so 38 brothers stayed while the rest of us boarded our last operational strike cruiser and translated into the warp on a heading for Hetheron. The warp voyage took 3 weeks subjective time, though I had long since learned that time became meaningless in the Immaterium and that clocks could only provide rough approximations of the distance between departure and arrival. I spent those weeks in the Apothecarian, such as it was aboard our reduced vessel, performing final maintenance on equipment that I knew I would never use again. There would be no gene seed extractions on this deployment, no preservation of genetic material for future generations. When brothers fell, they would simply fall, their progenoid glands dying with them, 8,000 years of genetic heritage returning to dust without ceremony or preservation. The liberation felt strange, like taking off armor that I had worn so long I'd forgotten I was wearing it. For 2 centuries, I had dutifully extracted and preserved gene seed from every fallen brother, performing my sacred function even knowing it was increasingly futile. Now I would be released from that burden. Now, when brothers died, I could simply honor them as fallen warriors, rather than as repositories of genetic material that needed harvesting. The morbid calculus of gene seed management would end, and I could return to seeing my brothers as people rather than as walking containers of valuable biological resources. We emerged from the warp into a system already half consumed by war. The orcs had established themselves across 2 of Hetheron's 4 inhabited worlds, their crude ships filling the orbital space like a green tide of scrap metal and barely contained violence. The Imperial defenders had been pushed back to the inner system, a ragged fleet of system defense boats and converted civilian vessels, trying desperately to hold the line while millions of civilians evacuated deeper into Imperial space. They had been calling for aid for 6 months. No one had responded until us. Chapter Master Vane broadcast on all Imperial frequencies, as we translated in-system, his voice carrying across the warp-addled communication networks with the authority of the Adeptus Astartes. "This is Chapter Master Vane of the Crimson Wardens. We have come to answer your call for aid. Hold your positions. We will break them." The response from the defending forces was electric, hope pouring across the Vox channels in a wave of desperate gratitude and renewed determination. They didn't know that we were a dying chapter on its last deployment. They didn't know that we numbered barely more than a standard company. They didn't know that we had come here specifically to die. All they knew was that Space Marines had arrived, and in the minds of ordinary humans, that meant salvation. We coordinated with the local defense forces and identified the critical point, an Orc megastructure on Hetheron IV, that served as their primary staging ground and reinforcement node. Destroy that, and the Orc offensive would collapse into typical greenskin infighting and disorganization. Hold it, and the Orcs would continue to pour reinforcements into the system indefinitely. It was the kind of target that normally would require a full chapter or multiple guard regiments to assault. We would be attacking with 137 warriors. The odds didn't matter. The outcome didn't matter. What mattered was that we would die doing what we had always done, serving the Imperium with absolute dedication, regardless of whether that service was appreciated or remembered or even noticed. We made our approach under cover of a lance strike from our cruiser, burning through the Orc orbital defenses in a storm of laser fire and exploding debris. And then we dropped. 137 Astartes in drop pods, falling through atmosphere like meteors, crashing down into the heart of the Orc megastructure, with the fury of the Emperor's finest warriors. The landing was controlled chaos, ceramites slamming into crude Orc architecture with enough force to shatter metal and pulp any Xenos unlucky enough to be directly beneath our impact points. I emerged from my drop pod with my boat pistol in one hand and my Narthesium surgical equipment in the other, though I had already decided that I would only use the former on this deployment. Around me, the Crimson Wardens formed up with mechanical precision, decades or centuries of combat experience guiding their movements even as Orc mobs began converging on our position from every direction. And then we fought. Not with the careful tactical precision of warriors trying to minimize casualties and preserve strength for future engagements, but with the absolute ferocity of veterans who knew this was their last battle and intended to make it worthy of remembrance. We pushed into the Orc megastructure like a crimson knife, cutting through greenskin mobs with bolter fire and chain blade strikes, each brother fighting with centuries of accumulated skill and the liberation of warriors no longer concerned with survival. I killed my first Orc within 30 seconds of exiting my drop pod, a massive brute wielding a crude axe that would have split an unarmored human in half. It died with a bolt round through its skull, its bestial brain matter spraying across the corrugated metal of the Orc structure. I killed my second as it charged me from behind, spinning and firing in one smooth motion that Theron had drilled into me 200 years ago. I killed my third and fourth as they tried to mob me with their crude numbers advantage, my bolt pistol barking 3 times and leaving 2 more corpses cooling on the deck. Around me, my brothers fought with the same desperate intensity, pouring fire into the endless waves of Orcs that seemed to boil up from every corridor and access point in the structure. We advanced through sheer momentum and skill, pushing deeper into the megastructure toward its central power core, leaving behind a trail of Xenos bodies and expended bolt casings that marked our passage like breadcrumbs in a nightmare forest. The communications net filled with voices calling out targets and coordinating fire, the familiar rhythms of combat that I had heard in 1,000 engagements across 2 centuries. Brother Vane coordinating squad movements. Brother Sergeant Thamuse calling out a heavy weapons position. Brother Kravak cursing as an Orc power claw tore through his pauldron and scored deep gouges in his ceramite. The voices of warriors I had known for decades or centuries, men I had trained with and served alongside, and would now die alongside, all of us burning bright one last time before we were extinguished forever. The first brother fell 17 minutes into the engagement. Brother Othris, 140 years of service, brought down by massed Orc gunfire that overwhelmed his armor's integrity, and punched through into his fused ribcage. I watched him fall, saw his body crumple in the distinctive way that indicated catastrophic organ damage, and some ancient instinct screamed at me to go to him, to extract his gene seed, to preserve what could be preserved. But I had already decided that we were past preservation, so I simply marked his fall and continued fighting, honoring him by killing the Orcs that had taken him down. More brothers fell as we pushed deeper. Brother Tarvek to an Orc power claw that sheared through his helmet and crushed his skull. Brother Valance to a lucky shot from an orc rocket that struck him directly in the chest and detonated with enough force to breach his power pack and immolate him from within. Brother Sergeant Kovan, when a collapsing section of the megastructure buried him under tons of scrap metal and twisted girders. Each death was marked on my helmet display as a red rune winking out, the tactical overlay showing our force composition shrinking in real time as we traded our lives for meters of corridor and burning orc corpses. We reached the central power core 4 hours into the engagement with 83 brothers remaining. The core itself was a massive tangle of crude orc technology and captured Imperial machinery, a pulsing heart of barely contained energy that powered the entire megastructure and linked it to the larger orc warg field that coordinated their activities. Destroying it would require planting demolition charges at specific structural points while holding off the increasingly desperate orc defenders who finally realized we intended to blow their prized structure to scrap. Chapter Master Vane organized our remaining force into a defensive perimeter around the core, while our tech marines placed the charges. I found myself back to back with Brother Valkus, a relative youngster at only 80 years of service, both of us firing into the endless tide of orcs that poured into the chamber like green water, finding every crack and crevice. My bolt pistol ran dry, and I switched to my combat knife, the blade feeling light and almost fragile in my enhanced grip after decades of primarily using it for gene seed extraction rather than combat. An orc came at me, massive and stinking of fungal sweat and machine oil, its crude weapons raised high to bring down on my head. I stepped inside its reach and drove my knife up through its throat and into what passed for its brain, feeling the blade scrape against the inside of its skull before I withdrew it and moved to the next target. Another orc, and another, a red tide of violence that felt strangely clarifying after 2 centuries of slow administrative death. This was what we were meant for. Not paperwork or bureaucracy or waiting patiently while our gene seed degraded. This. Violence in service of something larger than ourselves. Charges set, one of the tech marines called over the vox. Detonation in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Time to withdraw, to pull back to our drop pods and extract before the entire structure came down around us. Time to preserve the survivors and escape to fight another day. But we had no another day. We had come here to end this, and ending it meant ensuring the demolition succeeded, even if that required us to hold position until the charges detonated regardless of whether we could escape. All brothers, hold position. Chapter Master Vane ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos around us. We hold until detonation. No withdrawal. We end this here. No one argued. No one questioned the order. We simply continued fighting, pouring our remaining ammunition into the orc mob, switching to blades when our guns ran empty, using our ceramite-encased fists when our blades broke, fighting with every weapon and technique that 2 centuries or more of service had burned into our muscle memory. The orcs seemed to sense that something was wrong, that we were fighting with a desperation that went beyond normal combat intensity, and they pressed harder, throwing themselves at us in waves that should have broken any normal defense. But we were not normal defenders. We were the Crimson Wardens, and we had spent 200 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every battle and every loss, and every bitter year of watching our gene seed degrade, teaching us how to let go of hope and simply focus on the mission. We held because holding was what we did. We fought because fighting was what we were. And when the charges detonated with a roar that shook the entire megastructure and began a cascade of secondary explosions that would reduce the entire complex to molten slag, we were still fighting, still holding our ground, still serving the Imperium that had abandoned us to extinction. The ceiling came down first, massive sections of scrap metal and reinforced orc construction material collapsing under the force of the explosions and the structural failures spreading like cracks through ice. I saw Brother Valkus crushed beneath a falling beam, his armor crumpling like paper beneath the weight. Saw Chapter Master Vane firing his bolter one-handed while he held up a section of wall with the other, buying precious seconds for brothers to escape the collapsing chamber, even though he must have known he couldn't follow. Saw a dozen brothers make last stands at choke points and access corridors, holding off orc mobs while the structure died around them, their sacrifice buying time for others, even though there was nowhere left to escape to. And then the floor gave way beneath me, and I was falling through levels of collapsing structure, my armor's systems screaming warnings about structural integrity and critical damage. Explosions blooming above and below and around me in a storm of fire and flying debris. I hit something hard enough to crack my helmet display and fill my mouth with the copper taste of blood from my enhanced Haymasterman organ working to keep me conscious. The world became a kaleidoscope of fire and pain, and the deep grinding roar of billions of tons of orc construction material collapsing into its own footprint. I don't know how long the collapse lasted. Time became meaningless when every second contained enough trauma to fill a lifetime. But eventually, the noise began to fade, replaced by the crackling of fires and the distant rumble of secondary explosions still working their way through the megastructure's remains. I found myself buried beneath a pile of debris, my armor's power supply failing, my helmet display dead, my body reporting damage to at least 4 of my enhanced organs. I tried to move and felt something grind in my chest that suggested catastrophic internal injuries. I was dying. Properly dying, not the slow genetic death that had consumed 2 centuries, but the immediate physical death of a warrior whose body had finally accumulated more damage than even Astarte's physiology could endure. The realization came with a strange sense of relief. I had watched the Crimson Wardens die for 200 years, had documented every stage of our extinction with clinical precision, had preserved our story so that someone someday might know what had happened to us. Now I could stop watching. Now I could stop documenting. Now I could simply let go. But before I did, I activated my helmet vox one last time, broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies, in case anyone was listening, leaving one final testimony to what we had been and what we had done. This is Chief Apothecary Kale of the Crimson Wardens. We came to Hetherone to die, and we have done so. The orc megastructure is destroyed. The system is secure. Tell Terra that we served until the end. Tell them that 8,000 years of genetic heritage ended not through corruption or failure, but through administrative indifference and bureaucratic delay. Tell them that we died well. I paused, coughing blood into my shattered helmet, feeling my primary heart begin to fail. Tell them that service is its own reward, even when that service is forgotten. Tell them that we were the Crimson Wardens, and we never retreated, never surrendered, never faltered in our duty. Tell them my voice failed as my secondary heart stuttered and stopped. The darkness at the edges of my vision expanded, consuming the last fragments of sight and thought and awareness. My last conscious moment was spent thinking about Theron, about that day 238 years ago when he had summoned me to the Apothecarian and shown me 3 progenoid glands that revealed our doom. I wondered if he would be proud of how I had carried the burden he gave me, or if he would be disappointed that I had not found some way to save us. But the question became irrelevant as consciousness finally failed, and I died, buried beneath the ruins of our last battle. My gene seed dying with me and returning 8,000 years of genetic heritage to the dust from which it had come. The Imperial records do not show when the last Crimson Warden died. The chapter's fortress monastery on Scoria was discovered abandoned approximately 23 years after the Hetheron engagement, its cryopreservation units still humming with power, still maintaining the useless gene seed that would never create new warriors. The 38 brothers who had remained behind were found dead at their posts, victims of a dark Eldar raid that had caught them with insufficient numbers to mount an effective defense. The High Lords of Terror formally dissolved the chapter in the year 935. M41, approximately 217 years after Chief Apothecary Theron first discovered the genetic degradation that would doom them. The fortress monastery was stripped of useful equipment and decommissioned. The gene seed reserves were catalogued, studied, and ultimately destroyed as too corrupted for any possible use. The chapter's colors and heraldry were retired, their battle honors were transferred to their parent chapter, and their name was struck from the rolls of the Adeptus Astartes. In the year 941, N41, Terra's gene seed production finally increased to levels that would have supported systematic distribution to chapters experiencing non-critical degradation. Several chapters received genetic material refreshes that saved them from the same fate that claimed the Crimson Wardens. The High Lords noted in their records that the increased production had come too late for certain chapters whose requests had previously been denied, but that the overall improvement in gene seed availability should prevent similar losses in the future. No one from Terra ever visited Hetheron to confirm the Crimson Warden's last battle or to recover any remains. The System Defense Forces built a small monument on the ruins of the Orc megastructure, a simple stone bearing the words, "They came when called," and the symbol of a crimson gauntlet. The monument lasted 17 years before it was destroyed in another Orc incursion, and never rebuilt. The local population eventually forgot that Space Marines had once saved their world, because in the Imperium, yesterday's salvation is tomorrow's forgotten history. The only complete record of the Crimson Warden's gene seed crisis and extinction exists in a single data archive prepared by Chief Apothecary Kale in the years before his death. The archive was transmitted to Terra as part of the chapter's final tithe obligations, and entered into the vast records of the Adeptus Administratum, where it sits to this day, unread and uncatalogued. One more piece of data among trillions in a bureaucracy that spans a galaxy and processes information at speeds measured in decades or centuries rather than days or weeks. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in war, there are casualties not just of warriors, but of memory, not just of battles, but of entire histories, not just of individuals, but of institutions that served with honor for millennia before dying quietly in the dark. Their extinction noted in ledgers and never mourned by anyone who might have cared. The Crimson Wardens served for 8,000 years and died because paperwork moved too slowly to save them. Their fate was not unique. It is merely one example among thousands of how the Imperium consumes its own, grinding up lives and legacies and leaving nothing behind but incomplete records and fading scars on worlds that have long since forgotten why those scars exist. This is what service costs in the 41st millennium. This is what loyalty earns. This is the truth that the Imperium will never acknowledge, that warriors can die not through any failure of courage or faith or dedication, but simply because the machinery of government is too vast and too slow and too indifferent to notice when its component parts are failing. The Emperor protects, they say, but from what I have witnessed and documented and carried for 2 centuries, protection is a lie told to those who need comfort. There is only service, only duty, only the grinding continuation of function until function becomes impossible and entropy claims everything and everyone who was foolish enough to believe that their service mattered to anyone other than themselves. The Crimson Wardens believed in service. They served with honor. They died with honor, and they were forgotten with the casual indifference of an Imperium that has too many warriors and too many wars and too much history to remember every chapter that fails to survive the slow grind of entropy and time. They deserved better. They deserved to be saved. They deserved recognition for their 8,000 years of loyal service. They deserved a response from Terra that came measured in months rather than centuries. They received none of that. They received exactly what the Imperium gives to everyone, nothing but the opportunity to serve until service becomes impossible, and then oblivion. This is their story. This is their testimony. This is their warning to any chapter or warrior or institution that believes the Imperium will notice when they're dying and intervene to save them. The Imperium does not notice. The Imperium does not intervene. The Imperium simply continues grinding forward across the centuries, consuming lives and legacies with the same mechanical indifference that it consumes worlds and civilizations and species. You serve until you can't serve anymore, and then you die, and then you are forgotten. This is what the Crimson Wardens learned. This is what they paid 8,000 years and 1,000 lives to understand. This is the truth that they wanted preserved, even knowing that no one would read it, even knowing that no one would care. They died well. They died serving. They died as Adeptus Astartes, warriors of the Emperor, defenders of humanity against the darkness. And the Imperium barely noticed they were gone. Now you understand what service truly costs in the grim darkness of the far future. If this testimony of extinction through indifference moved you, if any part of this tragedy resonated with your understanding of what loyalty should mean versus what it actually means in the Imperium, then let it be remembered beyond this moment. Subscribe to ensure that other stories like this, other truths that the Imperium would prefer remain buried in forgotten data archives, continue to be told. The Crimson Wardens cannot speak for themselves anymore. Someone must speak for them. Someone must remember. Even if that memory changes nothing, even if that memory saves no one, even if that memory is itself just another piece of data in a universe that generates and destroys information faster than any being can comprehend, they served. They died. They were forgotten. Don't let it happen in silence.